Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101. This happens to be for our class for Tuesday, for the 6th. And I wanted to talk about 3 additional chapters in our textbook that can help us with speech number 1. Wanted to talk a little bit more about speech number 1 as well. And our upcoming first quiz, which will be next class, as well as registration. So I apologize for the technology problems that I had, which meant that I had to post a old video or a video from previous semester, but I'm hopeful that that video gave you an overview of the previous 3 chapters that I had assigned. And hopefully all of these chapters will be useful to you as you are putting together your first speech. So as you know, speech number 1 is a 5-minute autobiographical speech. So basically, you've got 5 minutes to tell the audience a little bit about yourself, whether you give a life overview and you decide to focus on highlights, or whether you want to talk about a specific time period or a specific event. There are lots of different ways to go about it. And in fact, in today's class, I'm going to have some sample student speeches for you to review. These students are in no way affiliated with GCC, but hopefully that'll give you a bit of a sense as to how you could proceed with an autobiographical speech. And that's going to be on the 13th of April, which happens to be a Tuesday. And you have the option either of uploading a pre-recorded speech to Moodle. If you do so, I suggest probably the easiest way to go about doing that is to upload it to YouTube and then to put the YouTube link onto Moodle. Or you can present your speech live via Zoom. At this particular point, I've heard from only one student indicating that they're interested in utilizing the Zoom option. So if you think you're interested in Zoom, this is one last time, last call, if you will, to let me know about that. And prior to the first speech, so prior to the 13th, I wanted to have some kind of a practice session consultation with you. In other words, a way for me to touch base with each of you individually about how things are going with speech number 1 and any ways that I can assist. And of course, if we were meeting in person, this would be fairly easy. But since we're not meeting in person, you've got multiple options. You can email me and let me know that you would like to meet via Zoom. And we can arrange a time and we can do that. Or you can email me and say that you would prefer just to interact with me via email, and we can do that as well. Or you can email me and let me know that you would prefer phone conversation, and we can work out the details for that. Or we can work on some combination. So that should be done before the 13th. Now, we've talked a good amount about some of the classroom textbook material thus far. And in fact, by the ending of today, we would have covered most of the textbook. And that's very deliberate because I wanted you to have that information so that you could put together your first speech. And of course, the following speeches as well. Your informative, which happens to be 10 minutes, and your persuasive, which is 15 minutes. Quiz number 1, though, is not necessarily going to cover everything that we've talked about up until this particular point, but quiz number 1 will be due next class, or will be posted next class, I should say, and that's the 8th on Thursday, and I will take that as your attendance question, if you will. So you've got 24 hours in which to do the quiz. It'll be 20 questions, mostly short answer, perhaps a few multiple choice or true false. And it's open book, open notes, so you can look up any of the information. The information is from what we've been reading in the textbook and also what I've been talking about in my class videos. And basically what I'm asking you to do is to take that quiz and to send it to me via PDF to my email. That's the easiest for my grading program. My email happens to be ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. And again, open book, open notes, 20 questions. So the idea is that it's covering some of the major pieces that you probably want to consider in terms of delivering a particular speech. And in terms of the registration that's coming up as well, again, I just wanted to remind you that registration is now open for both the summer and the fall semesters. Of course, things still are in flux at GCC, but right now, and in the world, but right now the plan is that in the fall, GCC will offer lots of modalities or options for students. Some classes will be entirely online, some classes will be in person, and some classes will be hybrid. And of course, that can change depending on world events. For the summer, what you'll see is that many of the classes are not yet staffed. And I can at least share with you the summer classes that I'm going to be teaching if you've got any interest. And in summer session 1, I will be teaching English 247, which happens to be a women in literature class. And in summer session 2, I will be teaching public speaking, this particular class, as well as CMN 153, which happens to be a medium popular culture class. And all 3 of these classes will be completely online. So if you have any questions or concerns about these classes or just about registration in general, just let me know. So where we are today is talking about 3 chapters that I'm hopeful will be useful to you. The first is delivering speeches. The second is culture. The last is audience. And in terms of delivering speeches, there are many different ways that one can go about delivering a particular speech. This particular class is focusing on the extemporaneous speech. And you can see this in the notes below, that the extemporaneous speech is prepared in advance and delivered with a speaking outline. In other words, what the Toastmasters video I talked about. You're not supposed to be memorizing this speech. A memorized speech ends up sounding stiff and stilted. It's very difficult to deliver, so you don't want to do that. A manuscript speech is a speech that's read from either a manuscript or a teleprompter, and you don't want to do that as well either, because you want to have some interaction with the audience, or in this particular instance, you want to have some interaction with the screen. So you can think of the screen as basically your audience if you are recording your particular speech, or even if you are presenting it via Zoom. Now, sometimes it is appropriate to give a memorized speech. Usually they're very short, highly formal events. Think of something like a toast at a wedding. A manuscript speech could also be appropriate in particular instances. Let's say, for instance, you're delivering a political address in which there really is little or no room for error. So then you could be reading the speech, let's say, off of a teleprompter. But those speeches are usually, again, very, very confined to specific events and situations. And the impromptu speech is the spur of the moment speech that you deliver without any preparation. I've always said that that's a dangerous speech to deliver because you just don't know what could happen if you haven't prepared ahead of time. Think about being given an award that you weren't expecting and you're asked to give a speech. Obviously, you haven't prepared ahead of time if you received an award that you weren't expecting. My advice is just to keep it short and simple so that you don't end up making mistakes. But certainly what you don't want to do is an impromptu speech for something like speech number 1 in our class, which happens to be an autobiographical speech. And yes, I know it's about your life and you know your life quite well. But again, you don't want to just talk without having some kind of preparation. That's where the speaking outline is so important. And as I indicated, the speaking outlines in the textbook are probably much too detailed for anything that would be useful for you when you are delivering your speech, because the outlines in the textbook really are written outlines, so that if you were to go through that outline, you'd get the speech word for word, verbatim. So it's useful for you when you're reading, but the speech that you are going to, or the outline you're going to be using when you're delivering your speech, should just be keywords and phrases, much like the notes that I put at the bottom of these videos. But again, every person has their own style. So that's one of the things we'll be doing with speech number 1, is trying to figure out what your speaking outline will be like. And it's one of the things that I'm going to be asking for, that in addition to you uploading your speech, that you also send me your speech outline, or in addition to presenting your speech via Zoom, you also send me your speech outline via PDF to my email address, so that I can take a quick look at your outline. I'm evaluating it informally, just on a checkmark scale, but I just wanted to be able to give you a little bit of feedback. And I liken the outline to the net a trapeze artist uses, that you probably don't need it. You may not even need to refer to it, but it's always good to have in case of an emergency. So that's something also that we can talk about during the practice session, is how things are going with your outline. And I wanted to talk about a little bit the teleprompter speech, and that many times people think that if you're reading off of a teleprompter or off of a manuscript, you can't make a mistake. And the reality is, oh yes, you can make a mistake. Just think about something like technical failure with a teleprompter. And you'll see below that I have a brief YouTube video, and it's entitled Watch Teleprompter Fail Video. And it happens to be about Michael Bay, the famous director from movies like the Transformers. And you'll see in this 2 or 3 minute video that he was supposed to give a presentation about his work, which he obviously knows very well. He's reading off a teleprompter. The teleprompter experiences some technical difficulties. He's not able to continue, and in fact, he runs off stage. Even a professional like himself can be rattled by not having the technology working. So you definitely want to make sure that you're not necessarily relying completely on technology, which is why I think the extemporaneous speech is such a nice speech, because in the event of some sort of an issue that you weren't anticipating, you should be prepared enough so that you can talk with your audience and deliver the information to them. It's one of the suggestions I have too about the speaking outline, that you actually use this piece of paper or a note card rather than having it on a screen, because then again, if you have technical difficulties, let's say on your laptop, then you've just lost your outline as well, and then you're going to have to go blind. So some things to consider in terms of delivery. Your voice. You want to be conversational. You don't want to sound too stiff or formal. Have a conversation with the audience. And vary things like volume and speed. Sometimes go low, sometimes go higher, sometimes go slower, sometimes go faster. And again, the Toastmasters video had discussed this as well. You want to think about how well you are enunciating, in other words, forming your words, which is different than pronunciation. Enunciation is about avoiding mumbling. So that's what you want to do. Now, pronunciation, you're not going to be able to change that in a short period of time, nor should you try. If you're afraid that you, for whatever reason, are not able to deliver a speech that your audience would understand because you've got some pronunciation challenge, you might even want to tell the audience ahead of time that English is not your first language, for instance, and that if you have, if anybody in the audience has difficulty understanding your pronunciation, to please let you know that just put the burden on the audience, not on you. So, and even pronunciation is tricky. Different regions have different ways of pronouncing words. And, tomato, harassment, Caribbean. So the idea is that your audience should be able to understand you. And pausing and silences can be very useful for dramatic impact. Again, I'm basically reviewing, again, what the Toastmasters video I talked about. Other things to think about, proxemics, which is a term you may or may not have heard of before. It's the use of space, and it can very much influence how an audience responds to you and how you respond to an audience. For instance, if you happen to be delivering a speech in a lecture hall, that would be a very different sort of situation than delivering a speech in a small classroom. And even the arrangement of the furniture, whether it happened to be rows or circular, all of that is related to the use of space and can influence how ultimately an audience responds to you. Affect display, also I wanted you to think about in terms of speech delivery. Facial expressions, because this is how most people are going to be reading what it is you're saying. Even though individuals should be paying attention to the content of your speech, they probably are going to be paying more attention to the way in which you deliver it. So things like your facial expressions. Again, you want to try to be conversational, you want to try to smile, you want to try to maintain a certain level of eye contact, even if that happens to be eye contact with the camera because of the situation we happen to be in today. And facial expressions tend to be rather universal from one cultural group to another. So a smile generally denotes happiness, and a frown generally denotes unhappiness. And there's been some interesting studies that have been done with individuals who are very challenged with reading social cues and very challenged with relationships, where they identify a frown as a positive thing and they identify a smile as a negative thing. And I suspect it has something to do with misreading those cues. So we get a lot of information from gestures. There can be conventional gestures. In other words, it's a gesture that we've assigned a meaning to by custom. For instance, so a thumbs up, for instance, might be considered to be good, but we've only assigned it that particular meaning. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that. We can have gestures that are descriptive, that are based on a size and shape. So you can show how big something is or how high something happens to be. And you can also have indicators that express feelings. So you can perhaps put your wrist onto or slam your fist onto the table to illustrate a point. The thing with conventional gestures is that just because we've assigned a gesture a particular meaning, that doesn't mean that another group hasn't assigned a gesture another meaning. So you have to be careful, and you need to think about which group you're presenting to, and how ultimately one meaning can be misinterpreted in another situation. In fact, this is something that the military spends a good amount of time talking about. And when they have their soldiers go abroad, that the gestures in the United States might have very different meanings abroad and vice versa. And they need to understand the distinction between the two so that there aren't misunderstandings. Again, eye contact, ideally you would vary it across your audience, or at the very least, the two sides of the room, left and right, and the middle, to give the appearance that you are scanning your audience. For a situation with the camera, it's probably just looking at the camera as much as you can, and think of the camera as basically your audience. So I can't remember if I shared with you the story about Nixon and Kennedy, and this was in the very early days of presidential debating through television. So television was still a fairly new medium. And when Nixon and Kennedy were giving the presidential debate, approximately half of the audience watched that debate on television, but approximately half of the audience listened to that debate on the radio. And the pollsters found two very different results after they gathered all of their data. That the majority of individuals who listened to the debate on the radio said that Richard Nixon was the winner because his arguments were more articulate and cohesive. However, the majority of individuals who watched the debate on television came to the exact opposite conclusion and said that Kennedy won the debate because he looked and appeared presidential. And for better or for worse, Kennedy is much more photogenic than Nixon, and Kennedy really understood the power of media. He used makeup, Nixon didn't, and that makes a big difference when you're on camera. Kennedy was very clear about how he sat. He wanted to make sure he wasn't slumping, what he was wearing, making sure nothing was wrinkled, things of that nature that Richard Nixon didn't do. And also, for lack of a better word, Richard Nixon was a sweater. In other words, and I'm not talking about an article of clothing, when it became hot, you could see him visibly sweat. And in a television studio with those hot cameras, that's exactly what you saw, which made him appear nervous. So I use this as an example to illustrate that in the end, it's usually, while it should be about content, it's usually about the way that we present our message. And that oftentimes influences audiences much more. And again, think about your daily interactions when you're trying to gauge whether or not someone is being sincere when they're speaking with you. You're not only evaluating their words, but you're evaluating their body language, and you are evaluating their facial expressions. So the idea with body language is that you should try to vary it. Again, I know that if we're delivering to a to a screen, you may not necessarily be in full body mode. I'm not in full body mode at this particular point, and I'm not requiring you to be in full body mode if you're not comfortable to do that. But definitely you want to not appear too stiff. And you also don't want to be slumping as well if it happens to be that you're standing and sitting. In other words, you want to try to find that happy medium. Now, the other chapters that I gave you about culture and audience was thinking about the ways that other individuals perceive your particular message. Culture is a very complex topic that we could devote an entire semester to, but probably the best definition, or at least the most general definition that I can come up with, is culture is any group membership. So once you've got a group, and I guess we could debate whether two people qualify as a group or whether they just are a pair, but once you've got three or more people, that is a group. And based on that group membership, there are certain predictive elements. So you can perhaps predict some behaviors based on individuals' membership in that group. Their attitudes based on their membership in that group. Their beliefs based on the membership of that group, and also the values based on the membership of that group. However, just because a member is of, or just because a person is a member of that group, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will exhibit all of these things, because we all have individual difference as well. This is where stereotypes come in, and we assume that everyone in a group is exactly the same, and that's not the case. However, if you've got a particular group membership, then chances are you can determine things like behaviors, which happen to be actions. And that can include your conversational style, whether you tend to be more informal or formal. That can also include things like whether or not you are direct or indirect with your message. Americans have been called very direct in the way that they present themselves, while other cultures, for instance, Asians, have been called more indirect, not necessarily getting to the message immediately. One is not necessarily better than another, it's just a different way of communication. Attitudes. And these are feelings. And again, you can have some predictive element about the attitudes or feelings of individuals in a group. Beliefs, what people think happen to be true or false, there's a predictive element within that in a group. And then values, which happens to encompass all of the above. And they are very highly resistant to change. And this will be important for us when we start talking about the persuasive speech, where I always say that the goal of the persuasive speech is not to persuade everybody to believe exactly what you believe. I don't think that's unrealistic. I don't think that's realistic. I think that's unrealistic. And I also think it's unhealthy. I think we are all entitled to individual difference. The goal is to earn your audience's respect. But I know that in the persuasive speech, you might be choosing something that really is questioning somebody's value system. And regardless of how strong your speech is, they may never change their value system. And that's not a reflection of your speech. So, again, we'll talk more about this as well. Our society is made up of many cultures, multicultural. When we talk about culture, we usually talk about these large cultural groups based on things like age or gender or ethnicity or education or political affiliation. And again, you can think about how all of that can influence things like behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and finally values. But cultures can be much more specific. Cultures can be based on a specific geographic area. A culture could be based on a particular hobby or interest. For better or for worse, GCC itself is a culture. It has predictive elements of behavior, attitudes, values, and beliefs. And I always use an example about time with GCC to illustrate this. When I was first starting at GCC and I went to my first meeting, and I thought that I had gone to the wrong room because no one was there. And I had arrived about 10 minutes earlier or so, and the room was empty. And I was wondering what to do. And 10 minutes elapsed, which means the meeting should have begun, and still nobody was there. And as I'm getting ready to leave, about 5 minutes after the meeting should have started, somebody walks in, and I asked, what's happening? They said, well, don't you know about GCC time? And I said, well, what's GCC time? And it's like, oh, all the meetings start about 10, 15 minutes late. I'm like, oh, really? And of course, when in Rome, do as the Romans. I like to get to meetings early, and I realized that all that was doing was frustrating me if the cultural group there, was going to get to meetings late. So my compromise was, if I got to the meeting on time, then ultimately I would be early. So think about how cultural groups can influence things like values and beliefs and expectations. And I've heard many students say, that GCC is different from other even community colleges. And I've had students say that community colleges have different cultural elements than universities. And certainly colleges have different cultural elements than high schools. And certainly schools have different cultural elements than workplaces. And we can go on and on and on. So something even as small as our class, it can be a cultural group in that we are all sharing experiences together. So when you're thinking about your audience, because obviously you are going to be presenting to an audience, you are going to have lots of different cultural groups in your audience, obviously. And there's even a name for this. It's called demographics. And this is based on the observable characteristics of individuals in a group: their age, their gender, their ethnic background, their education, political affiliation, religion, and so forth. And the hope is that at least you've got some information about the demographics of your audience so that you can make some judgments about how to present your particular message. And while you aren't going to be able to address every cultural group, the one thing we do know about our audience is that we are all enrolled or teaching PCS 101 at Greenfield Community College. So in that way, that's our shared commonality. And sometimes you can observe things like gender and ethnicity, and sometimes you can't tell from observation. So again, it's a tricky situation, but you want to try to keep in the back of your mind, how can you make your message appeal to the broadest group possible that would be in your audience. And then lastly, the text talks about hostile audiences, and I doubt you would ever be in a situation where you would encounter a hostile audience. Usually somebody is well aware when they are entering into that kind of situation, let's say in a political realm. But you might be walking into a skeptical audience, someone, audience members that aren't necessarily supportive of your particular message. And I think you can utilize some of the same techniques. I don't have necessarily a magic bullet or panacea on how to go about dealing with a hostile or a somewhat skeptical audience. But establishing goodwill, that everybody has good intent, trying to show areas of agreement that, yes, there's lots of disagreement, but at least we can agree on these areas. Using credible outside sources can help with your argument, which is one of the reasons why with the persuasive speech I'm going to ask you to use outside resources, though that's nothing that you have to do with your first speech. Being professional, so at least you can earn your audience's respect that you're well prepared. Using humor appropriately, again, because sometimes humor is culturally based and can be misunderstood. And being as multi-sided as possible. Sometimes people just want acknowledgement that there are other positions. They don't necessarily want complete agreement, but they just want to be acknowledged that there's another way of viewing outside of the way that you happen to be presenting. So those are basically the major elements that I wanted to talk about in the text. And what I wanted you to do now was to watch some sample autobiographical student speeches. These were speeches that were posted on YouTube, and they are in no way affiliated with GCC, so you don't have to worry that one day your speech will be evaluated by one of my classes. And all three of these speeches are autobiographical speeches, and they all take very different kinds of techniques on how they go about presenting. Now, there's some things that we aren't going to be able to evaluate. For instance, length, in that they weren't necessarily trying to deliver a 5-minute speech. And I'm certainly not going to be sitting there with a stopwatch when you are giving your speech. But what you want to do is to try to the best of your ability to get within 5 minutes. You don't want to go too much over, too much under. Figure you've got about 30 seconds to a minute of wiggle room on either end. And as the speeches get longer, you've got more and more wiggle room. So we can't necessarily evaluate the 3 student speeches based on length because these 3 student speeches were delivered for other instructors, I'm assuming, that had different criteria. And we can't even necessarily evaluate these speeches on volume because we can manipulate the volume on our computers so that we can hear. But we can definitely review these speeches in terms of content. Things like, is there a good introduction, body, and conclusion? We can review these speeches in terms of delivery, in terms of presentation, all of the other elements that we've talked about over the semester. The first autobiographical student speech I chose very deliberately because it is set in a military setting, and that is a cultural group, the military. So since we were talking about culture, I thought that would be a nice speech for you to begin seeing, and that obviously because it's a military setting, then the expectations and the assumptions are going to be different in terms of delivery, and you will definitely see that. And then the second speech, you'll see that it appears that somebody was basically recording that particular speech at home. I'm assuming it was a situation that's similar to this one, where they could upload a pre-recorded speech. And then the third speech, you can see that this was a speech that was filmed that somebody who was presenting in class. And for today's attendance question, you would be basically reviewing these 3 speeches. So the attendance question will be due Wednesday, the 7th of April by noon, but if you need additional time, let me know. And what I would like you to do for each of these 3 speeches that you are watching is to list one strength of each of the speeches and one weakness of each of these sample autobiographical speeches, which is exactly what you will be doing with each other, by the way. Eventually, after you upload your speeches, you will be viewing the speeches of your peers and identifying a strength and a weakness and sending that to me, and then I will be compiling all of that data and then making that available on Moodle. But at this point, since we aren't talking about each other, we can all view that information, so I'm asking you to do that on our discussion forum. So next class, I will be posting our quiz and updating you as to where we are in terms of speech number 1. And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will talk again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.